Anthos Identity Service is an authentication service that lets you bring your existing identity solutions for authentication to multiple Anthos environments. Users can log into and use your Anthos clusters from the command line or from the Google Cloud Console, all using your existing identity provider. If you already use or want to use Google ID to log into your Anthos clusters instead of an oidc or LDAP provider, see connecting to registered clusters with the Anthos Connect Gateway. This is the Anthos Identity Service (oidc) architecture. Auth flow starts when a user run a gcloud anthos auth login command and input their login details for the identity provider. This retrieves an identity token from the provider. The token is added to their kubeconfig file and is used when making requests with kubectl to the cluster. The K8 API server then uses Anthos Identity Service to validate the ID token and allow, or deny, access to the cluster. In our example, we are using Azure AD as our third-party identity provider. This Active Directory have been set up with 2 users: yannipen21@gmail.com, rick@yannioregonmicrosoft.com. We are going to use user Rick to sign on to the Anthos cluster in order to run kubectl commands. Next, we have registered an application. In Azure Active Directory, Azure AD, a client application is any software application that can access Azure AD resources. This represents our Anthos Identity Service. This registered application called Anthos GCP have a tenant ID, client ID, and client secret. We are going to use these properties to fill out the configurations in the Anthos Identity Service. We have a cluster called CNUC, one that is a bare metal cluster with Anthos Identity Service enabled. The configurations for CNUC1 have been set to point to Azure Active Directory. The tenant ID, client secret, and issuer URL have been set, along with the redirect URL which initiates the auth flow. Set the attributes for user claim and group claim in order to retrieve the proper information about the user and the group user belongs to. Next, we will go through the authentication flow and get a kubeconfig for the user Rick. We described the Anthos Identity Service architecture previously. In order to initiate the authentication flow, we must retrieve an Anthos Identity Service client config file. To do this, we run the command gcloud create login config. The create login config requires an existing kube config that has cluster RBAC read access to the cluster, which we retrieved using container fleet memberships get credentials command. After create login config is successful, you will see a kubectl anthos config YAML file. Next, we will use this client config YAML file to log in with an Azure AD user. When a user wants to log into a cluster from the command line, they must first run a gcloud anthos auth login command. We will log in with user Rick. Input the login details for the identity provider. This retrieves an identity token from the provider. The token is added to their kubeconfig file and is used when making requests with kubectl to the cluster. The K8 API server then uses Anthos Identity Service to validate the ID token and allow, or deny, access to the cluster. After the authentication is successful, let's take a look at the kubeconfig generated. This kubeconfig contains the identity token from the provider for user Rick. It is used and validated when making requests with kubectl to the cluster. Authentication is often combined with Kubernetes role-based access control, RBAC, to provide more finely grained access control to clusters for authenticated users and service accounts. Here we use kubectl to apply admin user role to the user Rick. Now with the RBAC set and Rick's kubeconfig, I'm going to use it to run kubectl commands from a Bastion host VM that can access the Anthos cluster. Export the kubeconfig with the Rick's kubeconfig path. Now we can run kubectl commands as the user Rick. This concludes the Anthos Identity Service overview. Summary for configuring Anthos Identity Service with Azure AD. 1. Configure client config on cluster with client ID, secret, tenant ID, etc. 2. Getting the client config file by running a gcloud command. 3. Using client config YAML to log in with your Azure Ad User 1 by running gcloud command, and go through UI flow to get kube config as RIC. 4. Assign RBAC for RIC on K8 cluster. 5. Use the kube config to run kubectl commands as RIC.